Like I said, Doug will be joining us shortly. In the meantime, I did want to just start and sort of introduce who will be speaking today and the goal of it. So today's session is Bring It On, ESG plus DivvyCloud, a debate on the future of cloud security. Doug Cahill will be joining. He's the Vice President and Group Director of Cybersecurity for Enterprise Strategy Group. And of course, you've met Brian Johnson, who is the SVP of Cloud Security from Rapid7. I'm Christopher Hertz. I'll be moderating today. I'm the Vice President of Cloud Security Sales for Rapid7. But Brian, why don't you just start off with a quick introduction of yourself, maybe just 1 or 2 minutes of background and who you are. Obviously, some folks met you earlier with your conversation with Corey, but might be useful for everybody who's sort of new to it. And then we'll go from there.
Man, if I spend more than 2 minutes talking about who I am, there's going to be a lot of people leaving.
Absolutely.
Just real quick before we do that, though, I do have a question. Somebody said that they did. I asked questions. You buy a new chair? They said they didn't buy the chair. I'm trying to figure out if they borrowed it or if they have it on layaway. Anyways, layaways. I'm not even sure that's the thing anymore. Hey, my name is Brian Johnson. Some of you know me from previous life at DivvyCloud, where I was the CEO and co-founder for DivvyCloud. I came on board over here at Rapid7 as a part of the acquisition at the beginning of the year. Just real quick background on myself. Prior to founding DivvyCloud with my co-founder Chris Doremus, both Chris and I worked for Electronic Arts. I made video games for 7 years, mostly massive multiplayer online games. During that period of time, worked as a sysadmin, as a programmer, ultimately as director of online operations for EA when I left, and overseeing all of the big MMOs, lots of servers, lots of data centers. We had probably for the part of the EA that we worked with, that Chris and I worked with, we had probably about 7,500 blades, give or take, in 6 different data centers around the world, and we migrated that, a good chunk of it, into AWS in 2011. Got a lot of scars from that particular experience that translated into Chris and I saying, look, we're going to go and solve some of this. Look, but quite frankly, we didn't, as many of you know, we didn't start out to solve necessarily a security problem. We really started out to solve a challenge with how we're going to transition from traditional IT into this new world. And in that, we discovered some massive security issues that would need to be addressed. But there's so many different problems that our customers and that hopefully future customers and other people in the industry see with this, and security is definitely a part of it. But man, there is just a ton to cover. Doug is here. Doug, how you doing, man?
Perfect timing, Doug. So Doug, why don't you just a quick 1 minute introduction for yourself, and then we'll roll right into it. Oh, we can't hear you, Doug.
While waiting for Doug's microphone, the answer to my previous question was that they bartered an employee.
I think we just heard him.
How about now?
Hey, Doug.
You're here, Doug.
All right, fantastic. Hey, it wouldn't be a live event without a couple of technology gremlins, right? So
it's what proves that it is live.
I was going to say, we're not listening.
Absolutely.
So Doug, we were just doing introductions. If you want to do a quick introduction of yourself, 1 minute, and then we'll roll right into the discussion.
Fantastic. Hi, everybody. My name is Doug Cahill. I'm the VP and Group Director for the Cybersecurity Practice at the Enterprise Strategy Group. And I am always up for a discussion about cloud security. So we're looking forward to today's session.
Without further ado, let's dive right into it. So one of the things that I know you all, in talking about before, this is really a view of what does the future look like of cloud security. I think one of the first things that we want to talk about and have you two discuss, and maybe a little fisticuffs, is whose job is cloud security these days? Whose job is security?
Doug, you want to take a point on the start of this, and we'll see if we agree.
Yeah, Brian, I'd love to. It's a great question because it's a team sport. Hey, so when we talk about cloud security in general, right, one of the basic constructs is that the shared responsibility model with respect to the division of labor between the cloud service provider and the subscriber of the services. That sort of notion of a shared responsibility should also be internalized by the project team. So, the devs, the DevOps leads, the cloud engineering team, the members of the CCOE shouldn't be looking at the security team as, hey, it's your responsibility. It's really a shared responsibility. And so there has to be a cultural shift here where all of us that are writing code, that are committing code, that are doing continuous integrations, delivery into production, that are monitoring production environments all need to be treating security as our own responsibility. It has to be shared. And I think that's, if we sort of, hey, that's what DevOps is all about, right? At the end of the day, that was about breaking down sort of organizational boundaries between teams and having a highly transparent and collaborative culture. I think that's where it starts. I mean, call me a little Pollyanna, but Brian, that's my take. What do you think?
Yeah, look, I think for you and for many of us here who've been in the IT industry for probably way too long, there is this natural pendulum that swings between sort of how you distribute and centralized, and I think this is sort of another one of those patterns that's always been a natural tension between who's going to own what. And we always go back and forth in things, and it tends to follow innovation cycles. I think as things go through a sort of a more innovative and sort of transformation, we see that ownership get distributed further out, and a lot of that's being driven by the fact that, quite frankly, at the beginning of these things, none of us know what we're doing. I mean, it's we like to say we do, but when we went into cloud, you learn so much so quickly about what your actual goals are and the actual problems you face versus what your assumed problems were. Like, for example, when we moved into cloud originally, when I was DA, our biggest thought was that cost was going to be our biggest problem. Well, quickly we figured out that was not accurate. It was going to be security. And so as we sort of move that ball forward, everyone's learning at the same time. So you distribute this model out, and everyone's got ownership of different pieces. And then as we get better at it, we begin to centralize that ownership model. And people start to take sort of stances on who's going to own what a little more in a more sophisticated way. We're starting to get to that point right now. I think that there has been this sort of push to say that engineers need to own security, and I would love for that to be true. But I think the reality is engineers and engineering teams need to own security as it relates to their application and what they're doing, the code they're deploying, the application they're running. But it would be unreasonable to ask engineering to own the security of the environment, because they just don't, that team, that product team doesn't have full visibility or time, for that matter, to look at the entire environment, understand context. And so I think, to your point about teaming, the security organization needs to own the security for the broader context, for the environments in which these applications live in, for everything that surrounds and supports these applications. And they need to be the ones that are driving the best practices. They need to be ones who are educating the broader population about how things need to be running and governed inside their world. But they need to do that from a, hopefully for those who were earlier, Corey and I talking about a consultative approach, you need to be doing that with the engineering team. But I do think a majority of the security ownership still falls onto the security team. And as we move further into the future, where Kubernetes is playing a bigger role, we start to see a little more collapsing of the centralized processes, security will continue to have a big role. That's not to say engineering shouldn't have a role in security and cloud security. They need to make sure they're doing what they're doing. But I do think as the pendulum swings, the security and centralized functions will start to regain some of that responsibility.
Yeah, I think one of the ways we could frame this up is thinking about the full stack and the full life cycle. Your point there, Brian, about sort of spreading it out across the team, I think makes good sense. And so the security team, in this case, probably the cloud security architect or the security members of the Cloud Center of Excellence, responsible for policy. They're responsible for vetting the CSP security posture. They're also responsible for providing the dev team, the project team, security controls, which integrate with the tool chain that they're already using. So that as a dev, I can take responsibility, to your point, for my part of the life cycle. So, in my IDE, I'm doing static analysis. When I push to or make a commit to the repo and we're doing a build, we can start doing dynamic or integrated application security testing. And then ultimately, if I'm in a DevOps and risk engineering role, infrastructure management role, I can automatically apply runtime controls. So that's spreading it out by, sort of life cycle, the different stages of the app. So the full stack is secured. But I can't really disagree at the end of the day, the security team is on point here. They're going to be defining policy, but I also think it's really important that they're providing, the tools that allow security to be integrated at every step along the way.
Brian, I think you're still muted.
Earlier, notice I did that then too, and the reason still is that I have a very loud keyboard. So I couldn't agree more, and I think that as we watch this play out, one of the things that we're paying very close attention to is the role that Kubernetes is going to play in the future of cloud security and security in general. And Kubernetes will, if it's done properly and we're able to get good adoption in the market, it's going to drive things like easier multi-cloud adoption. It's going to drive things as an entry point into cloud. And what will be interesting to see as we do that is how much of the quote unquote central command and control gets sort of grabbed for or re-implemented because the security teams and the IT team own the Kubernetes clusters, but the engineers are deploying into the Kubernetes clusters. And one of the things one of our board members had said, look, the pendulum always swings, but what's often forgotten is the z-axis. So like while things look the same, they're not exactly the same as they were. And so I think if security moves into this maturity that we're going to go into over the next 5 years, as we learn how to properly leverage cloud in a secure fashion, as we do it strategically, we start to get our arms wrapped around things like CSPM and identity, which is going to be a big challenge for all of us in the next 5 years. As we get better at that, there's going to be this desire and this sort of natural inclination to leverage Kubernetes to regain that control. And I think one of the things you mentioned is that will only be successful as long as we stay out of the way. And so in the end, if we go back as an industry to being the gatekeepers that are in the way, and you've got to put a ticket into Jira to get a container deployed, it's going to not do as well as it could. We can leverage automation and tooling to get ourselves out of the way while still allowing engineers to have access that they need and enforcing security and policy in a reasonable way. And so to your point, bringing those tools left a little bit, engaging them in the build the CI/CD pipeline, getting that education to the left is a critical part of us as security professionals being able to do what we need to do without getting in the way. But if we don't do that, look, they're just going to go around us. They did it once, they'll do it again. So let's not pretend like the genie and go back in the bottle.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack here. Where you're going is sort of like, the cyber team can't be the purveyor of no. Project teams are chartered with going fast and being asked regularly to go faster. And so enter your point about Kubernetes sort of becomes, I don't know, like the control plane or the operating system for cloud native applications and infrastructure. It is, it's the vehicle to deliver services to those who need them. So it's almost like, ideally security becomes, where it's, you're automatically able to check configs of an infrastructure as a code template before that gets pushed into production. You're automatically able to your point about identity, vet whether or not a service account that is the context for invoking the API is properly permissioned. If we can codify all those things and it becomes sort of an intrinsic feature of Kube and really the service mesh around Kubernetes, that's a huge win. I do think there's still need for workflow though, right? So there's still going to be visibility and audit trails and some level of accountability. So we can, security is about, hey, first visibility, but also measurability. Now it's also, I think the tooling is also, you're sort of going here, Brian, is also snapping into the workflow, sort of how project teams work together. That could be via Jira. So there needs to be that sort of feedback loop where security is, part of the CI/CD feedback loop from, production environment back to dev. So I feel like the plumbing is there. And it's sort of one part people, a big part process, and then also having the right tech that integrates with these worlds.
I mean, the tooling is absolutely there. I mean, I think back to when we were trying to automate some of the things that we can automate now, 15 years ago. For those who were writing expect scripts back then, will understand that we didn't really have the proper tooling to do some of the automation we wanted to do 15 years ago. And part of that was driven by the fact that the infrastructure we were working with didn't have the API plane to interact with. We didn't have the ability to do some of those things, but we do today. And I think to that end, it's super critical that we find a way to leverage the different automated capabilities such as remediation or plugging into workflows. Because I think one thing that we as security professionals and IT professionals, as we look at the industry, we see something that sometimes is lost when you're talking to individual product teams, and that is scale. When we have a couple of customers that have 1 billion events, if you look at their CloudTrail log every month that happens in their cloud environment. Well, an application team regardless of the size of the application, is only going to represent a portion of that particular element. And so as security professionals, as IT professionals, we're having to interact with that level of scale that is just mind-numbing. And the only way we're really going to get there is through tooling and through automation. If we try to shove these things back through our traditional processes, it's going to fall apart on us. And look, I think it is, I don't want to scare all the engineers in this call, like, we're coming for your access. That's not what this is all about. But it is important to note that at context and at scale, there are a lot of lessons that were learned over the last 20 years or last 30 years of securing infrastructure that we want to bring to the table. But we have to bring those lessons to the table using modern tooling, using modern approaches and automation to help educate and secure the environments at scale and at speed.
Yeah, it's so I'm an optimist at heart, and I couldn't agree more that we have an opportunity here to leverage automation to keep pace with the rate at which we're developing, integrating, and delivering new code to production. Because the perennial challenge in cybersecurity of the acute shortage of cybersecurity skills, boy, it's not going away anytime soon. And so one of the things I hear from cloud security engineers, cloud security architects is, how do I scale with my project teams? Like, how do I replicate myself so I can participate in multiple Scrum teams? I'm making sure those agile user stories are being written, they're being implemented. How do I do that? And it really is, it's repeatability. It's just like we have IAC templates. We need to get to security as code templates. So we're codifying security, and then it's integrated and it's automated. And that's how we're going to get scale.
Yeah, I mean, one of the trickiest parts of this is for anybody who's run or operated or been a sysadmin or a programmer or whatever it might be on a large scale, you quickly learn that standardization is key. And that is so important to you when you're paged at 3 o'clock in the morning to go figure out a problem, right? If you've got to go figure it out in every single problem individually in a different world, it's really hard. So standardization is critical. That is also true in this world. But one of the things we're going to wrestle with is, the engineering teams and the product teams are going to drive and push us to adopt new techniques and tools all the time. There's somewhere around it is a periodic table of DevOps tools that has to get regularly updated all the time because there's new DevOps tools that enter the market and new ways of doing things. And as security professionals, we have to react to that and be agile, but we also need to bring standardization and sanity to the process. And so, for example, if you're running a multi-cloud environment, you really need to have that one policy that works across all of them, because having to express and explain and educate one policy versus another infrastructure versus that and why it's different, it quickly becomes very spaghetti, and it's very hard to communicate that. And imagine trying to communicate it so that spaghetti message at scale, at speed to the product teams. It's like anything else. If you can't communicate yourself effectively in a short period of time, you're just one of many signals that engineer is taking in that day. And you want to be heard and understood quickly. And so standardization is critical. Being agile in our approach and processes is critical. And leveraging tooling to help us achieve both those things, I think, is part of the success that we all need to plan for.
And Brian, let me jump in and move us to maybe a slightly additional topic. And I've just shifted the slides here slightly. I do want to read a quote, which the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed, which William Gibson, the author, and if you haven't read his works, I encourage it, said, and I think you were just touching this a little bit, Ryan, which is the future might look, it would be interesting, I think, to hear you and Doug talk about what does the next 12 to 24 months look like? What does 36 months plus look like for the world? And by the way, I think it's useful to say for everyone who's listening in, your future and someone else's future maybe look different, right? Again, to the William Gibson quote, the future is probably already here. There are some people who are already well using containers and serverless and going all in there. And there's other groups that are saying, man, that sounds like the future to me. And other people are saying, well, that's the past, tell me what's going to be 12 months from now. So maybe, but dig in a little bit, like what do you see on the first horizon? Let's just talk 12 to 24 months first. And then maybe we can shift from there and talk 36 months. So that makes sense.
Yeah. Doug, do you want to take the first swipe at this?
Sure, I'd love to. Thanks, Brian. Chris, I love that quote because, as you were sort of saying, every organization is at a different stage of their journey for cloud adoption and certainly cloud security, and that's totally fine. I think it's just about sort of understanding where you're at today, sort of benchmarking yourself, and then having a plan to move forward. Like one of the things I recommend to project teams that want to start to integrate security into their DevOps processes is just get an initial win, and then replicate that win. Don't try to boil the ocean. So I think that's sort of the current state of art where we're at today. Now, moving forward, to your point, the way I think about this is just the simple constructs of sort of people, process, and technology. I think from a people perspective, say in 12 to 24 months, that, cloud centers of excellence become more common. Cloud security certifications like those offered by SANS and CSA, they become as relevant as being a CISSP. I think, as more businesses running on cloud infrastructure, that, being a cloud forward security practitioner is going to be incredibly important for, for adding value to the organization today, but certainly career development. This notion of secure DevOps or DevSecOps, a bit of a third rail term in the market, I'm an optimist again, so I think it becomes the norm. I think, of course, security gets integrated with the right culture, with the right approach, with the right soft skills, and certainly the right tooling. But I also think about the increased level of abstraction that Brian was touching upon, and I think so things like serverless functions, I think, will continue to create additional confusion around the shared responsibility model. Certainly changes the threat model. So as we think about, additional levels of abstraction, we have to think about how that puts an organization at risk and sort of, moves the goalposts and how we think about threats. The other thing I think that happens, and it's happening now, but certainly will come into full force here over the next couple of years, is bringing cloud into the SOC. Really thinking about threat detection and response for an organization's cloud footprint. So just like we do endpoint detection and response, being able to get that event telemetry, stream it off of our cloud footprint, and to be able to automate and orchestrate how we respond to those events very efficiently. A little further out, this is like further out in the horizon, I think the notion of like CCOEs and cloud security architects go away because, of course, we cloud. Like it's not a new environment, new technology. So it just becomes part of the digital enterprise. For example, the cloud security architect becomes the security architect because the security architect understands cloud. He or she is already an expert in that domain. Security becomes a feature. It's an intrinsic component. I love the way Brian talks about the role of Kubernetes moving forward. Now, with all that said, I'm mindful that we still have old technology. We have containers that talk to mainframes today. So I do think even in 36 months that we have a heterogeneous mix of the technology stack. And to secure that stack, we're going to have convergence of disparate tools into platforms. We're starting to see the emergence of cloud native security platforms. I think that's goodness. And I think we'll be getting, convergence of discrete controls into platforms that'll make it easier to integrate those into kube clusters so security can be a service. Yeah.
And look, I think, unfortunately for the audience, I think we're generally aligned. And maybe I'll try and find some things to disagree on just for the sake of doing it. But anybody who works with me knows that's a fun game. So I think that what we tend to agree, and I think over the next 12 months, one of the things that is going to be really interesting is to watch how the 12 to 24 months, we are still going to have this, to your point, cloud center of excellence with us for a little bit. And I agree that we'll move eventually to a point where the SOC and just your security architects are your cloud security, they're the same. But one of the things that I think is that we're still in a learning mode as an industry. I think we've gotten better at things like CSPM, at being able to, there is such thing as a CSPM now, which was by definition means we're getting better at it. But the next big hill we're going to tackle, and a lot of people I think around the world have seen this, is identity. And I talk about it a lot because it is a big, scary thing that a lot of us haven't figured out yet. And it's going to be that next big wave of areas where attackers are going to be able to leverage the complexity of a cloud identity against us as we go out there into the world. So I think we still have a lot of learning to do. And because of that, whether it be identity or Kubernetes or containers or cloud or whatever it is, there's cloud center of excellence and that need to be focused on a specific skill set and grow that skill set. Needs to exist inside the organization for the next 12, 24 months as it goes. Now, as we get into that 36-month horizon, I think we start to see some really interesting things. I think we see a forced commoditization of the cloud market, which, I think there's probably some people on this call who would not like to hear me say that. But I think if you want to know where you're going, look at where you've been. And I challenge anybody to go into any data center on the planet and find one that's Dell servers only. It's just but we have this motion. It's something we've done before. Multi-cloud is a part of our future. Tooling like Kubernetes will create a commoditized infrastructure layer that we can sort of use however we need to, wherever we need to. Cloud providers will continue to create services that differentiate themselves, but it's going to be this tit for tat battle they all go through. And as people who use that it's great for us. It's a fantastic thing to have these providers fighting it out, because it's really going to bring some innovation to the market. It's going to give us the opportunity to pick tooling we need for the job we need. But as security experts, we need to understand that it's very likely that all this gets commoditized, and we need to be thinking about what that future looks like 36 months from now. And so as we go into that 36-month period, Kubernetes starts to play a big role in sort of the central deployment area. We start to see more adoption of things like Knative, which is basically serverless on top of Kubernetes. And look, there's a possibility it's not Kubernetes, but some layer of abstraction will occur. Some container orchestration will occur that will cause this to be easy to interact with, so the engineers don't need to care whether or not deploying in Amazon or Azure or GCP. This is the natural progression we're going through. And when we do that, I think we'll see the pendulum start to swing back towards a more, what we would consider traditional security model. And this is what you're talking about, and where we agree, is that eventually these cloud security architects become security architects. And 36 months from now, or maybe a little longer, the SOC of tomorrow will look different and feel different, but it'll have some similarities of the SOC of today. It'll just have a cloud DNA infused into it. And we're gonna go through the cycle, and who knows, maybe 5 or 6 years from now, 10 years from now, we're back on prem again. There's a whole argument being made about the fact that compute is getting cheaper and smaller and faster, and things like 5G are opening up the ability for us to have more distributed computing and edge computing. One of my favorite quotes from one of my friends who was in the industry for a long time is he said, "I was here when we went to data centers. I was here when we went to cloud, and I will be here when we go back to data centers again." It is just the things that we do. And I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. What I am saying is that we have to remember to be agile in our approaches and our thoughts, and recognize that this industry has a tendency to repeat itself. And we just want to take all the good things from our future and what that can be, and all the lessons learned from our past, and use them to our advantage as we move forward. And no, I do not work for Kubernetes.
And I will interrupt for one moment and just say to everybody who's listening right now, we will have some time in a few minutes to start asking questions of Brian and Doug. There is a Q&A tab that you can go to. There's a general tab and a Q&A tab, and you click on the Q&A tab, you can start typing your questions in there. Go ahead and start queuing those up, and then just in a few minutes, we'll start tackling some of those questions. Back to you, Brian and Doug. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah, I just wanted to riff on one of Brian's points a little bit. Unfortunately, Brian's brought identity into the discussion a couple of times, which is so apropos, because if you sort of follow the thinking here is, hey, underlying infrastructure is heterogeneous. IT has always been heterogeneous. So multi-cloud means heterogeneous. A level of abstraction through a common control plane allows us to sort of normalize how we interact and secure that underlying heterogeneous infrastructure. That's goodness. So then it becomes like, well, what are the things, what are the entities that we need to secure? We actually, DivvyCloud Rapid7 and ESG recently worked on a research project entitled Cloud-Driven Identities. And one of the big findings, unfortunately, was that organizations really struggle with identity and data governance, which is really about answering the question, who has access to what with what level of privileges? And it's not just human identities and user accounts, but increasingly with microservices-based cloud-native apps, it's services. Like, are we using like the wildcard operator, right, for privileges? And then in the context that I'm running a service account, I've got, unfettered downstream access to a set of services and therefore data assets. So I think this is going to be a big, area of focus here. It absolutely has to be, is really connecting these dots between, identity governance and data governance. And organizations, as infrastructure and data moves outside of the perimeter to the cloud, and that's that level of abstraction, it's a little bit hard to get your head wrapped around that sort of visibility gap. But I think this is being an area as an industry, we're going to be talking and focused a lot on who has access to what, with what level of privileges, and is that appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to hone in on that, one of the things I find so interesting, as the industry becomes more complex and complicated, and identity is a great example of that. I mean, it's like there's thousands and thousands and thousands of permissions out there that are just, and I want to plug a company that just I know of, and have any affiliation with. Rhino Security has done some great research on IAM and privilege escalation. It's just super fascinating and terrifying to sort of look at. But to that end, one of the things to think about, as this environment gets more complex, the tooling around it, especially DevOps tools and engineering tools, they will aim to reduce friction and make it less complex. There's a couple of ways to do that, but one of the ways is to just make it easier. And sometimes that looks like, I'll give you an example. The serverless framework, when I used it for the first time, I discovered that it creates an IAM role because, as a way of reducing friction if you do not provide one. But what it does is it creates an IAM role that basically gives you access to everything inside the environment by default, so that you can get your Lambda method deployed and up and running and quickly, and there's not as much friction. But the engineer doesn't necessarily know that that's what's happened. And so you end up with this role that's crazy permissive, that's associated to your test function you just deployed. And God, I hope that's in the right environment. And so I think there's going to be some interesting things we'll have to watch as we sort of go through this, as tooling aims to make it more simple and easy to get up and moving in certain areas. That will, by definition, introduce some wrinkles into our things like identity and that kind of stuff. It looks like we do have a question here I want to turn into. It says, with M&A activity, the way it's moving back, moving back onto on-prem will be more challenging for us. Oh, so basically with M&A activity, moving back on-prem will be challenging. I hate to be like Kubernetes, but I think that things like that will make it easier, because you're creating an agnostic plane, and whether that be on-prem or off-prem. And I think as we think about the future of hardware, it will become more API controlled. It won't be so static. And so I think that'll introduce another layer there. That's my take on it. Doug, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind, Brian, is having the optionality of choosing which tier of the application is deployed where. So I talk to a lot of companies that say, hey, you know what? I understand cloud is secure, but I just want my data tier on-prem. I want those data stores on-prem. But of course, I want business logic for access to on-demand compute. And of course, I want my presentation tier for access to content delivery networks in the cloud. So truly, hybrid applications are deployed across hybrid clouds. To do that, you need an orchestration tier like Kubernetes that can allow customers to employ that sort of, best fit approach, not just by, holistic application, but really by the tiers of the app. And now with, hyperscale CSPs having popped so close to customer data centers, there's not so much latency, right, between those tiers anymore. But the magic is in the orchestration, be able to move those tiers around. And as that's happening, security has to be along for the ride.
I have a question that I thought of, and as we wait for more questions coming in from the audience. You are an analyst. You talk to lots of customers that ask you smart questions about the future and what they should be doing. What's the one question that people don't ask you often enough about cloud security? Like, what's the thing that people aren't asking or aren't seeing that they should be asking of smart people like yourself?
Oh boy, I can rattle off the questions that I am getting.
Yeah, I mean, maybe start with a couple of the common questions you do get, because I think it might be informative for other folks. But then, is there one that you feel like, man, people are just not asking the right question of me?
Yeah. Okay, I've got a couple of thoughts. So the question I get most often is how do I start? So it really depends on the organization where they are, sort of how mature their cloud security program is. For those that are earlier days, it's really, how do I start? And my answer there is usually to talk about the connection between agile software development and DevOps, and the fact that this notion of shift left that Brian mentioned earlier really starts in the definition phase. So you really want to be, authoring, championing, and then authoring cybersecurity user stories as part of your agile process that then hopefully get prioritized for future sprint. They don't get pushed in the backlog. I also encourage cybersecurity practitioners to participate in scrums and to sort of embed themselves as a silent observer initially to understand, sort of the cadence in how that world operates, so they can start to get away from the phases and gates of waterfall to this iterative, collaborative, transparent, model that is agile and DevOps. I guess the question I don't get is more sort of career development. Like, hey, from a career development perspective, how do I make sure I'm a modern CISO or I'm a modern security practitioner?
Yeah.
He or she might have been sort of a ports and protocols sort of firewall manager. And I just think anything in tech, anytime you're in tech, you need to always be learning the next thing. And so I think being sort of self-aware of what your skill set is and how you need to modernize it is important.
And then we have a couple of questions that come in. I think I shift to one. Steve McIntyre, how do you see threat models, which are owned by the teams, helping to instill the thought that security is a team sport?
Hi, Steve. How you doing, buddy? That is a really interesting question. So let's think about that one for a moment.
The threat models, which are owned by the teams, helping to instill the thought that security is a team sport.
Well, I suppose the question is threat models, which is owned by the team. Steve, it'd be interesting what you mean by elaborating that. Which team are you referring to? Right? Are you referring to the application teams that are developing, or the centralized security teams that are owning that model?
Sounds like maybe he's implying the threat models are owned by the business units.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that and that might be true today. And I do think the threats that are going to be different. We're going to see a whole new wave of threats that are going to, like, somebody recently was talking to me about ML-based threats for, like, what happens when your ML becomes really knowledgeable about your data, and now you can ask it questions that maybe you weren't expecting to be able to ask it, and that's how you pull data out of the system. It's just, there's lots of fascinating things that are going to happen. Look, I think it's really about going back to sort of being consultative and really being there to help. I mean, if you think about it this way, one of the areas that cloud security and centralized IT can do is they can become experts. And this goes back to Doug, your point about sort of like, how do I get sort of career growth? Become experts in this area, because look, an app team may want to go explore a new service like SageMaker or whatever it might be they're going to want to go do. And you being there to provide information about what common best practices are, what common threats that are out there around those two things, I think are an important way to build that relationship. And then as you go to that next stage, right, the app team is going to be looking at the threats that are specific to them, and they're going to engage in that conversation. And I think that's what it's really all about, is sort of changing the dynamics and the tension from security professionals to be less about command and control, sort of this is what you can and can't do, and more about having a dialogue about best practices and what's going out there in the industry, at least engaging in the conversation, because I think that's probably the most important thing. Doug, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, it's sort of the spirit of it being a team sport. Music, everybody needs to be engaged. And what comes to mind here is considering a red teaming exercise against your cloud footprint, right? So have a third party come in. So try to have everything buttoned up naturally, right? But then have a red team come in and have them go through all the stages from recon to exploitation, and use that as a learning experience for the team, where they found out, hey, I sourced some open source libraries that had some organic vulnerabilities, or, I had an open management port when I pushed to prod, right? That's one idea. The other one is, and Brian, just to connect back to identities, the adversaries are going to continue to run the same plays that unfortunately work really well, spear phishing being the top here. And we're finding that privileged cloud credentials are getting spear phished. So if you're a dev, and certainly if you have access to your cloud console, or if you've got a privileged account, you need to be really aware that you're a target. And so just like, we need to do end user awareness training for knowledge workers to be vigilant about spear phishing, we need to be doing the same for the project team. And that extends for good coding practices as well. So I think red teaming would be a really interesting way for an organization to really get an objective third-party view on what their threat model is and where they're vulnerable.
Real quick, Chris, we had a question come in. I just want to address real quick around sort of DivvyCloud and the platform of enforceable policy. Well, we'll reach out after the session and chat with you one-on-one about that. I want to answer your question, but I also want to make sure that the conversation we're having here is not us peddling our wares, although as much as I'd love to do that. So we will reach out and answer your question directly regarding what DivvyCloud's roadmap is in that regard. Chris, do you want to do you have any other questions sitting in Q&A?
No, I think we're. Why don't we do last? Just wrap it up. We're going to be going here. Upcoming next is today's raffle drawing and closing remarks. Just so everyone remembers, this is a 3-day event. We're coming to the conclusion of our first day. Thank you for joining us. We've really enjoyed the engagement online through the chat and the questions. It's been absolutely incredible. So we'll be turning it over to Thomas Martin shortly, the CEO of Nefosec and former CIO of GE. But Brian, and we hope to see everybody back here tomorrow for our first session and all of our sessions. Brian and Doug, any closing remarks before we turn it over to Thomas?
So I have one closing remark. Well, I have two. First, Tim Cleese has joined us today. He is a part of the session. He is recently engaged. So I wanted to say congratulations to Tim Cleese out there. Congrats, buddy.
Hey, Tim.
And then, look, I think closing remarks is, I think it goes back to the skill gap thing that I was talking about a little bit. What do you look for today that is so imperative in people that we want to hire and bring to the market? It's that ability to have strong aptitude. This stuff changes so fast and so regularly. We used to hire for skills. Now I encourage people to hire for smarts. And look, we're going to learn this together. It's going to be a long journey, and I'm excited to be a part of it with you guys. Hi, Tom.
Brian, I love that. And I'll just echo that by saying, along with aptitude is positive attitude. And, the soft skills in today's sort of agile environment are so important. So part of retooling, cybersecurity is having a collaborative approach with the project team and understanding they're under pressure to move quickly. And if you approach it properly, security can keep pace at scale.
And I'd like to welcome Thomas Martin, who's just joined us. Thomas, I have set you up well. I said there would be singing, that you're doing an opera performance, possibly a raffle drawing, and closing remarks.